But we begin tonight with equal justice under the law. It's the basic bottom line concept that the legal system is supposed to work the same way for all of us. So whether you're rich or poor, white or black or brown, gay or straight, famous or not so famous, the legal system is supposed to treat you the same. That is the goal under the U.S. Constitution, at least. Of course, we all know that that is not actually how it works. And sometimes, just sometimes, we get a little reminder. Take a look at this. This is footage of Union Square in New York City on Friday. The crowd had gathered after being summoned online by Kai Cenat. Now, if you've never heard of Kai Cenat, join the club. I'd never heard of him either until my son Miles called me to tell me about this incident. Kai Cenat, as it turns out, is the very famous, most popular streamer on an app called Twitch, which the youngins use to live stream about gaming, sports, entertainment, and the like. He had advertised a huge giveaway of electronic gizmos, including PS5 gaming systems, which are really expensive. So, of course, the teenagers came in numbers, and the gathering turned unruly. Dozens were arrested, including Cenat, who was charged with inciting a riot and promoting an unlawful assembly. He was released on bond on Saturday and given a desk appearance ticket and a court date of August 18th, according to the Associated Press. Now, I just want you to think about those developments. As you listen to the folks on a certain non-news network with news in their name whining about how Donald Trump is being treated so poorly and so differently from anyone else. I mean, that is partially true. Trump and his supporters have been treated very differently from anyone else. Note again, with Kai Cenat and the riot in Union Square, famous person summons a crowd to a specific location using social media, turns into a riot. Dozens arrested on the spot, not a year later, like the MAGAs who attacked our Capitol on January 6th. Or like Trump, who's been gallivanting around as a free man for 2.5 years before he was charged with summoning them there to overturn the election. In Cenat's case, it's an immediate arrest and a court date within weeks. And that's not to say that these situations are exactly alike. I mean, for one thing, Cenat apologized for his part in causing the mayhem, and he hasn't cut a song with the people who landed in jail for jumping on top of cars and throwing bottles and punches. But they are alike enough that we can compare how the criminal justice system treats these two famous men and their followers differently. Of course, in Trump's case, the situation is far more consequential because it's not about a game system giveaway. It's about a president of the United States trying to steal the votes of tens of millions of Americans so he can stay in power. And the latest developments in the Trump case make it even worse. In just the last few hours, we have heard from Trump's lawyers responding to special counsel Jack Smith's request for a protective order that would keep Trump from making public any of the evidence they're turning over to his defense. Trump's lawyers claim that the proposed order is overbroad and frame this as the government seeking to restrict Trump's First Amendment rights. Perhaps the most consequential change they're requesting would allow Trump to make public some of the evidence, including recordings and transcripts of witness testimony. The request for the order came after the special counsel said that Trump's social media posts could, quote, have a harmful and chilling effect on witnesses or adversely affect the fair administration of justice. They cited Trump's post last week where he wrote, quote, if you go after me, I'm coming after you. And if that wasn't evidence enough, Trump has continued to make the special counsel's point, posting over the weekend and today multiple attacks on the DOJ, Judge Chutkan, Jack Smith, and his former Vice President Mike Pence, who could be a key witness in his trial. Joining me now is former Senator Claire McCaskill, MSNBC political analyst, Luke Broadwater, New York Times reporter, Kimberly Atkins-Storr, senior opinion writer and columnist for the Boston Globe and MSNBC political analyst, and Stuart Stevens, political strategist, senior advisor to the Lincoln Project, and author of the upcoming book, The Conspiracy to End America, appropriate title. And I just really quickly want to focus for just a minute on the disparity. And I will go to you first, Kimberly, because, you know, the cases aren't the same. And I'm not saying they're the same. Obviously, it's very different, a former president. What he did is much worse. But it still bugs me, Kimberly, that the people, set aside Trump for a second, who attacked our Capitol, live streamed it, right? Not on Twitch, but on other things. and then went back to their hotels, casually got on planes and went home. It was only a year later in most cases that they even got arrested. This was like some teenagers brawling or, getting too excited about a PS5, scooped up immediately. And the guy who called them there, who's not trying to overturn an election and who's not out there attacking the judge and prosecutors, he got arrested. I will propose to you, and I will let you respond, that our criminal justice system is definitely bifurcated, but not bifurcated against Donald Trump, bifurcated in favor of him. Your thoughts?
I think that's absolutely true, Joy. This is not the first time we talked about the difference in way the criminal justice system treats people as they perceive them to be a threat. Even the people who threatened our very democracy, the foundation of our government, were seen in a way to be less threatening. I remember on January 6th and the days after, I was shocked that these people were allowed to board planes and return home to wherever they were going. Surely, had it been a terrorist of a different kind, that wouldn't have been allowed to happen the same way you saw the swift action that took place in New York City. But to broaden this a little bit, Joy, we're talking about Donald Trump and his claims that he is being unfairly targeted and people are after him. He has been afforded far more lenience and leeway and grace by the justice system than any other person in the United States of America. He has been allowed to fly on his big old plane, to be arraigned very quietly. We only know about most of it because of his own posts. He has never served a minute in jail. He was never in handcuffs. He was never, no mug shots were taken. He has been treated with kid gloves so far, with all of the, with all of the luxury that a former president can get. So that is even more a far cry, considering he is indicted now as the ringleader of the attack on American democracy.
Yeah, and Claire, let me go to you on this because, you're a former United States Senator. I mean, we're talking about an attempt to stay in power that resulted in jeopardizing and putting at risk the lives of all 100 United States senators and every member of the House of Representatives and their staffs and police and Capitol Police and Metro Police who responded and the people who work in the Capitol, cleaning the Capitol and providing all the services. We're talking about threatening people's lives in addition to what's charged in the 4 counts, trying to deprive tens of millions of people of the right to vote. It is stunning to me that Donald Trump posts on his social, if you come after me, I'm coming after you, which we reported this on Friday, and we were trying to be very careful and very fair because we didn't know who he was talking about. Well, Jack Smith apparently heard his own name, heard the judge's name, heard the witnesses. He saw it the way we kind of assumed, that we saw it, right? And so this guy is now out there saying not only does he want to be able to threaten potential witnesses, the judge and Jack Smith, the prosecutor, but he wants evidence in the case that he wants to be able to put on his social. We know what he's going to do with it, Claire.
Well, this case is so bizarre in so many ways. I mean, first of all, Lady Justice wears a blindfold for a reason. Clearly, she's peeking, and she's peeking because we had a situation where at the moment these crimes were occurring, he was the most powerful man in the country. And everybody in the system was reacting in deference to his power. And they weren't prepared that day. Law enforcement wasn't prepared. They were not capable of arresting everybody on the spot because, frankly, there were a whole lot of people frozen because Trump had kind of laid the groundwork ahead of time. Don't anybody go after my people. I want them to be able to do what they need to do. So, here's the thing. In a normal criminal case, Joy, the defense lawyer would not be on national TV threatening witnesses with how he's going to cross-examine them, much less the former vice president of the United States. The defendant would not be trumpeting with a huge national megaphone threats against the prosecutor, against the judge, spewing vitriol against the people who are responsible for enforcing the law, against anybody, frankly, that's not willing to lie for him. So it's hard to understand what this lawyer thinks he's accomplishing by his national media tour. Can you imagine if Jack Smith booked an interview on your show tomorrow night and told all your viewers, I can't wait to cross-examine Donald Trump? Can you imagine the hue and cry that would rise from the masses of MAGA about how this prosecutor was on a vendetta? But meanwhile, the criminal defense lawyer is doing just that. It's not just Trump that's threatening these witnesses. In a way, this criminal defense lawyer is trying to telegraph to Pence, hey, I'm coming after you. I'm spending hours preparing my cross-examination. It's bizarre.